Shut up and sit down.
By all means, go for it. Have fun.
Yeah.
Just leave me alone.
People are coming together more and more and more and more as the government has been failing us more and more.
I'm against being shitty to people.
You can't research your way into understanding somebody.
One way or another, I'd rather have the fight now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Fight for Liberty Live. This is actually our 100th episode, and we have a really awesome guest that I'm super excited about. But before we bring him up, I just got to tell you guys a little bit about Nug of Knowledge. If you've been watching the show for a while, you already know Nug of Knowledge Premium Cannabis is one of your best places you could possibly get your CBD or Delta-8 THC products. Because it's all organic, healthy, clean, gotten from good people that we know and love in the Liberty movement. And then, this is owned and operated by people in the Liberty movement. So you get to get high and fight the state at the same time. So win-win situation. Go over to nugofknowledge.com. Use promo code F4L to get 10% off your first purchase and to help out the show and Free Speech Media Network. Speaking of weed, though, let's talk about our other sponsor, Mr. Tom Queter for New York State Senate. If there is any point in the show today where you were like, wow, David looks really, really baked, go tell Tom thank you with a donation. The link is in the description because I'm smoking weed that he grew tonight. So he's an awesome guy. He's running for state Senate. And we actually just had a fantastic fundraiser for him last night with Spike Cohen. So go on, help out on that campaign, and we really appreciate it. But tonight we have someone who I have been wanting to have on the show almost since the show started. Really excited to have him on. He's the founder of the 10th Amendment Center, Mr. Michael Boldin. Welcome to the show.
Whoa, no pressure. But 100th episode, that's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's really cool. I did not know it was the special.
I mean, honestly couldn't think of anybody
because we get a chance
to
hang out, right? That's why it's special. It doesn't even matter if it's 101 or 20.
Amen. And honestly, I went through a little bit of a rebrand of the show a few months ago, kind of a refocus back to what I wanted to do with it originally. And one of the catalysts for that rebrand was watching you on Spike Cohen's show a few months ago, because I was just sitting there going, these are the kind of guests and conversations. That was such a great episode. And I was like, this guy's actually out here doing stuff, like making people's lives freer in a really tangible way. Where most of the guests I had on for their, and no knocking these guys in any way, shape, or form, but leading up to that, I had just, a lot of other podcasters on who were doing, similar stuff to what I was doing. And, just not that kind of tangible change that we can look back on and say, like, yeah, I did a thing that is actually changing the world. YouTube channels are great, but there's a lot more to the movement than being a podcaster.
Right, I'm with you, man. So what do you want to talk about?
Well, first, just tell me about the inception of the 10th Amendment Center. What got you into the activism, and then what made you want to focus specifically on the 10th Amendment?
Well, I'm a former Trotskyite who was an anti-war activist here in LA from day one of the bombs dropping. I used to actually I've never voted, and I always thought everything was kind of gross. I looked at these things, and as I was growing up, I'm like, man, these people are just awful. And for me, war and imperialism just felt like a bad thing naturally, even though I went to government schools and was taught over and over and over that war meant you're bombing people to freedom, right? And I started doing some activism regarding some things in the Middle East. I was helping volunteer for an organization called Al-Awda. It's a right to return Palestinian, pro-Palestinian organization. I wasn't into the kind of imperial foreign policy over there, but really what got me wanting to do something other than just kind of being only out on the fringes was the bombs falling in Iraq in 2003. And that's when I was like, man, I gotta just get more engaged. So I started doing a lot of activism with California Peace Action. I was out in the streets when there used to be anti-war protests of 10, 15,000, 20,000 people on Hollywood Boulevard, or here where I live in downtown LA. I mean, that happened in New York City. It happened all around the world. Unfortunately, those protests were gone as soon as George W. Bush left, as if war only matters when a Republican kills people. And I think it was that kind of experience, because I started the organization in 2006, and really I started it just as a blog. I was like, holy crap, all these so-called like constitutional conservative types. And I really kind of hate that phrase. I guess it's kind of like how libertarians and the one true Scotsman issue, like they hate it when people call themselves libertarian, but they're really horrible, like on the drug war, for example, or on police issues, or like, how can you be really a libertarian if you're in favor of qualified immunity or asset forfeiture and stuff like that, right? So when I hear constitutional conservatives talk about things like foreign policy, and they're just terrible on it. And when you look at a guy like James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, he himself specifically said war is perhaps the greatest threat to liberty, because war gives you armies and debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And that's kind of probably a paraphrase, but doing my best on that one. And so the idea that people could be constitutionalists and be okay with an aggressive foreign policy, Madison's far from alone. I mean, basically across the spectrum at the time, they were all against the type of foreign policy we have today. I thought that was just absurd. So I'm like, I'm going to just start blogging and talking about how everything that these people do, they're either lying about it, or they're wrong, or they're misrepresenting things. And it doesn't matter which party's in power, government keeps growing no matter what. And so I started this blog back in 2006, 2007. It's kind of caught on a little bit. And I guess you can take note of the attacks that we've had, whether it's from former Bush administration, national security people, someone who represented, the torturers in the Jose Padilla case, went off on us in the Washington Post. We've got a 14-minute segment that Rachel Maddow did on us because, we support nullification, must be neo-Confederate and racist, things like that. So the more that we get attacked and hit by mainstream people, I think the more that we're doing some pretty decent work. Is that the short version?
Well, I can definitely agree with that last bit.
Everything else sucked, though.
But I think you can really tell when you're doing the good work when people want you to stop doing it.
Yeah.
So you said that it kind of took off after you kept putting that kind of stuff out there. What do you think was the thing that made you go from just a guy ranting on a blog to really something that people were paying attention to?
I still rant on a blog. I'm still just a dude ranting on a blog. I mean, I'm in my boxers most days. I work from home. I build a home studio, all that stuff. Nothing fancy, no Cato Institute type of loot where we've got our own building or anything. It's really very grassroots. It's me and a couple of other people and a bunch of volunteers who just bust our ass over and over, publishing new content, doing outreach. But then we also do activism. I don't know if there was like a point in time, but I think I'm just an old school promoter. I used to be a nightclub promoter. I was a promoter for many years. So I just took a lot of the kind of marketing tactics that I used to kind of guerrilla street style marketing tactics that I used to do for clubs in LA. And I just kind of applied it to the message that I do here. And I just found ways to reach people as much as possible. And mind you, again, so when the blog really started going on a regular basis was early 2007. We're not talking a heavy social media time at that point. So I would go over to Think Progress and literally post links and comments about anti-war posts. And I would, back when I mean, they don't exist anymore, but at the time they were pretty anti-war because Bush was in office and they're progressives or kind of a Democratic Party operatives, I guess. And so we would just do as much outreach as possible until other people said, oh, hey, I like what you're doing. I'd like to blog with you too. And so more and more people got in. And over time, we expanded it just from informational to actually do activism. There's a letter an article, a column that Samuel Adams published. They call him the father of the American Revolution. He published this article in the Boston Gazette, which was in essence the mouthpiece for the Sons of Liberty, the resistance to the Stamp Act, things like that. And in October of 1771, he summed up this great letter basically saying all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So I actually kind of put that into practice, trying to put that mentality into practice, that it's really a 1-2 punch. I mean, you were talking about how a lot of time you were just interviewing people who were interviewing other people. And there's I think in the liberty movement, there's been, the scales have been kind of outweighed more on the education end than on the concrete activism end. And if you have one, but you don't have, if people value freedom, value liberty, but they don't know how to defend it, or they think it's just about voting the bums out or suing in federal court, hoping to get federal branches of government to limit federal power. I mean, this kind of stuff doesn't work, nor did any of the leading founders tell us that's what's supposed to be done. And we can talk about how we're supposed to do things strategically or how things were expected to be done from people like Madison, Jefferson, and others. And so I thought, we got to do not just education. We can't just tell people to read books or watch videos or listen to podcasts. We have to show them how this shit works in practice. I think cannabis is one of the best ways. And I used to actually bring that message to right-wing audiences 10 plus years ago. They hated hearing about it, but I would point out to them, like, look, let's say you don't like what we have going on in California. You don't like the fact that Los Angeles has 1,300 weed shops and it's impossible to, and at the time it probably was 12 or 1,300. It went up to like 17 or so. I don't know what the number is now, but it's a lot. For a while there, this is gray market. This is before we're talking legal. There were more cannabis shops in the city of Los Angeles than Starbucks and 7-Elevens combined. So to me, that shows that when enough people say no to a government prohibition, enough businesses get involved in that as well, there's not much the government can do to force their so-called laws, regulations, or mandates down our throats. It's really about resistance. And that's really, surprisingly enough, that's really what the founders told us to do as well. Thomas Jefferson, his Kentucky resolutions of 1798. Are you familiar, at least lightly, or?
No.
Okay, so this is it's not something they teach in government schools, which is kind of a horrible thing. But Jefferson's known for being kind of the Declaration of Independence guy. But I think his second most important declaration were these resolutions that he drafted in 1798 in response to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts. It was about deportations. It was about criminalizing free speech. If you brought any member of the federal government other than the vice president, who was Thomas Jefferson, into what they called ill repute, that was a criminal act. I mean, there's a guy in Connecticut who was thrown in jail for publishing, and this is an elected member of the House of Representatives in Congress, was in prison for, saying bad things about John Adams and his foreign policy. He won re-election from jail. So Jefferson, what he did was he wrote these resolutions that basically said when the government does stuff beyond the limits of the Constitution, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. And the people need to resist on a state-by-state level. He said a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So that's how Jefferson approached it. And he was actually in the House of Burgesses in Virginia back in 1765 when Patrick Henry had almost the same type of principles in resolutions that he had introduced just 12 days after he got into office in response to the Stamp Act. So Jefferson learned that idea of, well, you know what? If you're not authorized to do this stuff, we are not bound to obey it. So why why wait for government to fix itself? And Jefferson started those resolutions out with, he said, the several states composing the United States of America are not united on a principle of unlimited submission to their general government. The notion that the federal or general, which is what it was supposed to be at the time, the notion that the general government could do whatever the hell it wants and you just have to follow it until it changes its mind is absurd. So the idea of resistance is very, very important. And I think the cannabis story has been incredible on that. It's the greatest act of mass nullification on an individual, local, and a state level, probably in American history. Especially if you're cannabis sponsor. I mean, I guess the East Coast is catching up. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, and I'm loving this this like Delta 8 loophole that they found in the few states that still have it criminalized. Thanks to the Trump administration, for whatever reason, they added a loophole when they legalized CBD federally, and there's only a limit on how much Delta 9 THC can be in stuff.
I didn't actually know the details of that. I've been seeing like places like Texas, they're trying to criminalize Delta 8 specifically on a state level, which I guess is unsurprising from a red state, but that's I'm glad you clarified that for me. I didn't actually know, because it's so easy. Like, I mean, I can go onto an app. I mean, do you guys have nice, easy delivery there in New York now too? Or
not yet? New York legalized, but we haven't legalized yet. They're still figuring out how they're going to fuck us and tax us and regulate
the taxation is always a huge thing, but there's been some studies here in California that the gray market is actually larger than the so-called legal market, and the legal market is huge. So some people are starting to recognize that the taxation issue is a problem. And in fact, the Dennis Perrone Act, and the man who legalized cannabis. Are you familiar with Dennis Perrone?
That name doesn't ring a bell, no.
Dennis is the guy,
teaching me all sorts of shit tonight.
Dennis Perrone is a hero, an absolute modern hero. He's not alive anymore, but this is the guy who really led the activism through the 1970s and 80s in Northern California, in the Bay Area, to open up dispensaries. He actually was running the Big Top Cannabis supermarket in the 70s before there was state legalization, anything. They would raid him, shut him down. He'd get out of prison. He would open up again, raid him, shut him down over and over and over and over and over. And over time, people in the Bay Area, if you think about this late 70s, early 80s, and this was a time the AIDS crisis was massive. If you think in the Castro in San Francisco, obviously New York as well, but there was a lot of community support that was happening here. And again, we're talking about it's almost agorism happening if you think of it like that. Really what they're talking about, if they don't even have legalization on a state or a local level, they're just running cafes. And over time what they ended up doing was they just decided to go public with it. They decided to open up like a 4-level coffee shop where it was just basically all weed and some snacks. And they brought the news cameras in, and they were expecting to get shut down. Instead, they got so much community support. It helped build the effort to pass Prop 215 in 1996 here, when the medical cannabis law first went into effect. But there's a great documentary, a short film, maybe like 15 minutes, called The Man Who Legalized Cannabis. That'll tell you a lot of the history about Dennis Perrone, P-E-R-O-N. I don't even know where I was going with that.
We're just talking about
stuff,
disobedience.
Yeah. So the weed story is so important because even if we're looking pre-1996 in California, there was a very strong movement in, like, people didn't just start buying and selling and growing and consuming this product once it was legalized on a state level through a vote in 1996. It was happening already, which paved the way. So all these advances for liberty really have come from the ground up. If we're thinking about individual liberty, the closer that the decision is made to the individual, obviously, the better that we're going to have a chance of having more liberty. And that's also the way we have to think about it as well. We have to actually take a stand for something. If we wait for government to do it for us, it never happens. I mean, we've all seen the memes of a dude like a skeleton saying, still waiting for Republicans to, cut the national debt or something like that, with all the fun things we can see online.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit. I mean, I obviously know the concept, but for those who don't, explain the concept of nullification and how one can go about that in their state or local area.
Okay, so the idea is if you don't like something that government is doing, you can't rely on that same entity to limit itself. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison specifically warned us that if you relied on the federal government to determine the extent of its own powers, you shouldn't be too surprised when those powers always grow, no matter what happens. Regardless of the vaunted checks and balances of the system, if you go to federal courts in the hopes of limiting federal power, that power is going to continue to grow. Anti-federalists warned us about this. Thomas Jefferson warned us about this. Madison himself in his report of 1800 specifically pointed out, like, okay, it's not just the other branches, but the judicial branch can also exercise dangerous powers beyond the limits of the Constitution. And so the notion is like, if you're waiting for government to limit itself, it'll never happen. So you need something outside of that government to keep it in check. In the American system, that's the people and the states. And the states means the states and their political subdivisions, local governments as well. But it's not just a government thing. It has to be individual action. So James Iredell, in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention, he ended up being, I think, the third associate justice on the Supreme Court. He was nominated by George Washington. He was a highly respected legal expert of the time. And he specifically was telling, like, okay, yeah, abuse is going to happen in any government that exists. He recognized that this is the type of thing that happens. But how do you deal with it? In this system, he was saying, if the government usurps power, so exercises powers not delegated to them, the people are supposed to resist. His words, resist, not vote the bums out, not hope that they're going to stop doing it, not begging them, but resist. Thomas Jefferson in those Kentucky resolutions told us that when government has like exercising bad policy, doing bad policy, but staying within the confines of the Constitution, let's say they followed the requirement to declare war on somebody, and they actually did that, which they haven't done since 1943. So all the foreign conflicts that they've been in are all illegal under the Constitution, plus the immorality of it as well. But let's say they were following the rule and they declared war on someone and we all thought it was just evil, right? Well, for Jefferson, he said, if they're within the confines of the Constitution, but they're doing bad policy, vote the bums out. He said a change of the members of the government is the constitutional remedy. But he says where powers are assumed which have not been delegated. So as soon as they do stuff that they're not supposed to do, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. And by nullification, we're talking about it. There's no actually specific kind of recipe on how to nullify, but it's a combination of actions, whether it's a refusal to participate in enforcement on a state or a local level, which we see with immigration sanctuaries, for example, legalizing on a state or a local level what the government prohibits, like, for example, with cannabis, banning enforcement again, like what we see just this year. There's been 2 states, Missouri and Arizona, have banned the state from enforcing a wide swath of federal gun control. That'll help bring it down. But with all of that, it doesn't matter what the states do. If the states say, oh, we're not going to help enforce gun control in Missouri, if everyone still follows the gun control laws, that doesn't change anything. So you really need that kind of combination. Like, it's much more difficult for people to oppose or to exercise their rights without getting permission from government if every level of government is against them. But if you can get your state or a local government to be on your side, or at least get out of the way, it makes it much, much more difficult for the federal government to do anything about it. And that's why we see what started in 1996 with Prop 215 here in California, legalizing cannabis for limited medical purposes, is now turned into 36 and probably soon more states. And I think, I don't even know the number that have legalized for recreational now, but a shit ton, really.
18?
I mean, this is,
I think something like that.
Yeah, and there's one, it's like 18, maybe 19, depending on one ballot measure. So yeah, with Virginia, and now Republicans getting in Virginia means they're probably going to slow down implementation on it. But there was a ballot measure that passed in, where's the Kristi Noem governor?
South Dakota.
Okay, yeah. So she's been fighting against that because she hates individual liberty, and she's been working to have that overturned. I mean, all of these people are just terrible. As a quick side note, what you'll find though is that each politician, whether it's a DeSantis or a Noam or somebody else, I don't know most of the names, they can be acceptable on one thing, and then because we're so busy in our lives a lot of times, and then you get the economic situation, which is, they're bringing people to their knees economically through all the inflation, the money printing and things like that. It makes it harder to have a normal day-to-day life. We don't have a lot of time to pay attention to everything. So one thing is really important to somebody, then they think that person's great on everything. So I always warn people against that. If you find someone who's good on something, you probably should dig in. I mean, support them when they do the right thing on one thing, but they tend to be awful on everything else. So in South Dakota, there was also a legalization ballot measure that was passed, but she's been fighting to have that overturned. So side note.
She's horrible.
It should be 19. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I find it kind of funny because for me, cannabis is one of my most important issues.
Same.
So even though I'm very, very anti-lockdown, was against the COVID stuff throughout all of it, I don't give a shit that she was good on the lockdowns or not as horrible as the rest. That doesn't matter to me at all. She is horrible. Because
it doesn't change your impression of her being bad. Because I mean, if you think about prohibition, so I can be happy that she was not shutting down businesses, right? And that's great. But that doesn't mean I think she's good, because she still supports the massive police state that is required, the civil asset forfeiture, the mass surveillance, the qualified immunity, all that garbage that goes along with the drug war. And the drug war is also a foreign policy nightmare. If you think about 40 years of war in Colombia that was funded and pushed by the CIA, the DEA, U.S. imperialism all over the world regarding the war on drugs. I mean, that obviously in Colombia, that isn't a cannabis thing. And they don't even need to do that anymore because they grow so much fine cannabis right here in California. You don't even have to worry about it. It puts the cartels out of business. So
good shit down there.
Can be. It can be. But we do get nice delivery here. I'll tell you that.
If they show up, I had a couple of delivery mishaps while I was in California last year. Just
what service did you use?
I don't even remember, and I used a couple different ones because there was a bunch of like get X% off your first order kind of deals. So I got my first order from like 3 or 4 different delivery services while I was down there, because I was there for only a couple of weeks, and I was like, I'm just gonna try to get as much cheap weed as I possibly can.
Right. Yeah, I never have any problems. I use a company called Ease, which is kind of like the Uber of weed. And a lot of Uber drivers or Lyft drivers end up driving for Ease. It's EAZE. And you basically, they just sitting there driving around, and there's like all these, they get an order, they get it on their app, and then they show up and boom, done. Or there's a couple of local ones that I use, a company called Sweet Flower, which is amazing. The first day of the lockdown here in Los Angeles, what was it, March 17th or something, 2020? The first thing, this is funny. The first thing that I did was I immediately was like, holy shit. I said to Sarah, I'm like, we got to order some cannabis. So I did my largest ever delivery order from sweetflower.com. And when the guy showed up, I gave him a nice cash tip. I'm like, you are my hero tonight. We're going to need this for the next few months. And here we are still today. Pretty wild.
Next few years, it seems like.
It's crazy. I mean, so the new vaccine mandate just went into effect. Are you in the city in New York?
No, thank God.
Okay. Where, like, how far out?
About 6 hours north, near Syracuse area.
Oh, so you don't have to deal with any. Syracuse was the grand depot of the Underground Railroad in the 1850s. It's a very proud place. There's a really important rescue called the Jerry Rescue. There's a monument up there. Daniel Webster, the hated Daniel Webster, came they would have these great anti-slavery conventions in Syracuse, and Webster would go there, and Webster actually went there during the middle of a massive one in like 1851 and said, we are going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act right here, even in Syracuse. But no, they had a very hard time because nullification was being used by all the northern states to actually not participate in the enforcement of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is one of the most horrible laws ever passed in history. Anyway, side note, I thought that was an interesting story. It's a really cool historical place up in Syracuse. So, but here in LA, the mandates just kicked in for vaccination. So I've been cruising around town a lot, seeing who's kind of asking me to show my papers, who allows me to go in. So far, no one's bothered me at all.
Yeah, thankfully up here, there's not too much of that crap. We dropped the mask stuff pretty quickly. It was probably like June or July of last year. They stopped being mandatory. They were still encouraged. Basically, whenever the vaccine started to be available, it became unvaccinated people have to wear a mask and vaccinated people don't. And then no one was really asking for your card. If you didn't have a mask on, no one was actually double checking that. So
and if you think about it, after people were put out of business for so long, the last thing, I think the only thing that, especially small businesses, the only thing they want to do is ask you, how can I help you?
Right. How can I get some of your money, please?
Any of it, right?
Any of it. For any reason.
Part of the sad part to me, the neighborhood I live here in downtown LA, there were tons of independent coffee houses, and I used to love going, and I'd spend every couple of days, I'd spend half a day at a coffee shop and rotate around. I mean, really, really great coffee too. Cool artistic venues and locations and stuff like that. Almost all of them are gone, but who can weather the storm of a shutdown are the 3 Starbucks within 4 blocks of my apartment. So all the independent shops get shut down because they can't weather that storm. But Starbucks can stay open because they've got the lids. And it's just another example. I mean, you get it, right? Government regulations, government mandates, they affect the small people the most.
And yeah, it's just one giant centralization of power move. Like, it's not, and that's one of the things that annoys me the most about libertarians is that we have we have a habit of like only looking at government as the bad guy in any situation and not realizing that like Amazon and Walmart and like Nike and Apple are also like really heavily into this crap. The news, a lot of people have their opinions of the media, but they don't take into consideration like who owns the media and who's making money off of that, and what else they own and why they're pushing certain things. There's a lot of businesses and business people and bureaucrats who we don't look at usually as when we're railing against government, who are just as much to blame. Some of them, I'd say even more than any politician as of late, because I think politicians nowadays are kind of just playing in a system where we've had specific businessmen come up in the last couple decades that are like actively trying to fuck us over. And
Amazon is pushed is working to push facial recognition surveillance on about 600 police departments around the country. And facial recognition surveillance is searching your face, your person, houses, papers, in effect, without a warrant, right? The only way you can use facial recognition or a cell site simulator or drone surveillance or any of this stuff is literally just to do mass warrantless surveillance. Amazon is one of the greatest instigators of this. Well, and maybe not instigators. Obviously, government loves this kind of stuff, but Amazon's very happy to work with them.
Right.
And I get the profit motive, but at some point, I don't care. I mean, yeah, I would like your business to be successful, but not at the expense of doing evil. So providing facial recognition surveillance is pretty bad. And then even if you think about surveillance on a local level, let's say they've worked with the Orlando Police Department for years. So Orlando does facial recognition. When they capture data, it all goes through systems, through fusion centers or something called ISE, which is information sharing environment. It's a post 9/11 Patriot Act kind of garbage. And so police in Boise, Idaho, in Honolulu, Hawaii, the DEA, the FBI, they all have access to this information. And local police through these systems then become part of a national police state. And that's pretty dangerous. I mean, I think as we can all see.
Right. Yeah, centralization of power is bad almost all the time. And it's also the most profitable. So there's always going to be a conflict there. The best way to do business is to expand, to like franchise out or something like that. You know, the more stores you have, the wider your distribution network, the larger quantities that you're doing everything in, the more you can streamline hiring and firing staff. Like all of those things make you significantly more profitable. It's not just because McDonald's has shitty food that's overpriced that they make so much money. It's because they're so fucking good at what they do. And they're so good at just popping out more and more McDonald's and more burgers. And now we live in a society where a bunch of people don't know how to cook a burger for themselves because they're so used to just going to McDonald's. And that's the same kind of problem as the people that don't know how to take care of their own health care because they've been on Medicaid their entire lives. You know, it's the same kind of
have retirement savings because we've got Social Security. Government's going to take care of us.
Yeah, the nanny state has been expounded, I think, by a lot of these big businesses and this kind of ease of life culture that we've built for ourselves that we don't. If the apocalypse happened, if like, you know, if January 6th was actually as based as we were hoping it would be, and the whole federal government shut down, and the whole country went into shit, there's a whole lot of people that would die just because they don't fucking know how to survive without Walmart and McDonald's.
I don't. I'd be absolutely worthless in the apocalypse. 100% worthless.
Your invitation to my apocalypse crew is being rescinded.
Well, I get all kinds of invitations and I don't understand why. I mean, the Oath Keepers years ago used to tell me like, hey dude, I don't know what you're going to do there in Los Angeles when this shit all comes down. You know, we got a spot for you in our bunker. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm able to make it up to Montana or wherever you are. You know, I can't even.
I mean,
how am I going to get delivery?
Yeah, I don't know if the cannabis still. Well, actually, no. I think one of the things that's going to
I'm
survive.
Just thinking, like, I don't grow food. I mean, like, I go and pick up my food as I eat it most times. So I'm not your survivalist guy here, but that's really important. And I like to know people who are so they can help me at some point.
My dad raised me around that kind of prepper stuff. So my parents are not libertarians, but they're like kind of staunch independents. And I know you shit on this phrase a little bit earlier, but I would usually consider them like constitutional conservatives for the most part. I
hate the term.
Right. But my
dad, can be good on spending. Maybe they're against the Affordable Care Act. They're against a vaccine mandate, but they have no problem. Well, I don't know about your parents, but they have no problem with invading Iraq or starving 200,000 children in Yemen to stop the terrorists. That's generally my view of a constitutional conservative. Now, I know that there's another genre of that out there, but when it comes to politicians like the Ted Cruz's of the world, that's generally what I see. I think a lot of people like to use that term because they're so concerned with, I want to make sure I self-identify as conservative in my lifestyle, and that's fine. I think you can have whatever lifestyle you want and be a constitutionalist at the same time. The notion is you don't want a centralized power dictating how people are going to live, a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. Yeah. So my dad, actually, what you said pretty well describes at least the way that my parents were when I was growing up. They've definitely moved on a lot of their opinions since I joined the Libertarian Party. But my dad has always been kind of a prepper, not to any kind of like a crazy level, but just like thinking about it. Like
that's cool.
I knew at a young age like where we were gonna go if shit went down. Like my dad, like I've been shooting since I was 8. That's been
so cool.
Like, you know, we do have a garden. It's not very big or very successful, or you know, we don't like raise like it's not a part of our lifestyle that we like grow our own food, but I do know how to grow food ish. And so, yeah, I think that definitely instilled in me that like kind of healthy distrust for people and the government that led me to being a libertarian eventually. But yeah, when I joined the LP, I was kind of still a neocon when it comes to war.
You came from you were a right winger as you came in. A lot of people seem to have kind of gone that direction. I definitely was not.
I was this weird kind of anti-war. Like I hated the wars that we were in because I saw them as stupid and wasteful and pointless and whatever. Like I was against the current wars, but I wasn't against war as a concept. I was still very nationalistic and, you know, like protect America because this is some bastion of freedom that like, you know, like we need to do the constitutionalist stuff, reduce power, yada, 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 and then still protect it because America is the best. And I was still kind of stuck in that patriotic, nationalistic thing that makes you justify borders and
actual
war.
National defense doesn't sound bad to me. I mean, they'll use national defense as an excuse for anything, but the way you're describing it actually doesn't sound bad. It's like not going abroad to find monsters to slay sounds fine. Like, of course you want to defend against invasions. That seems reasonable.
Yeah,
but
I still would have defended some sort of like preemptive stuff because that's the other thing. I was a big fan of, and honestly, like really where the nationalistic stuff was rooted in, like I valued American lives over other lives in the war concept. So whatever saves American lives, like if we could have done Hiroshima before Pearl Harbor, problem solved, right?
Collateral damage is murder. But yeah, I mean, I don't think I thought like that as I was growing up either. I mean, I was a Trotskyite. I mean, I'm probably a pretty bad one, but I like that's a big government dude, just a different version of it. I was raised in government schools. I was taught that whenever there's a problem, government is a solution. When there were airline bailouts as a kid, like I thought, oh, well, government, if they're going to bail out airlines, they should just own them. That was my immediate gut instinct on stuff. So my thought process, it was just a different version, I think, of what so many other people had, is that, you know, government's going to solve everything, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. I just am, for me, for whatever reason, the war issue just really, really stuck out for me.
Yeah, that was one of the ones that changed the quickest, and I was able to kind of learn. I was already on the right path, but I was able to kind of have the conversations. That's honestly, you know, we were talking about, you know, libertarians arguing with each other just a little bit before we started the show. The good part about that, in my opinion, is it really makes people figure out their beliefs. And you know, you really get to hear other people's opinions and decide whether or not you actually agree with what you think, or if you're just, that's what you were taught and that's what stuck. And so like the border issue, the war issue, there's so many things that just from debate after debate after debate after debate, I was finally like, I can't defend closed borders anymore. Like I cannot, with the beliefs that I hold about freedom and liberty and no government, I can't defend a closed border system anymore. I'm losing debates. I don't like this. I think maybe I'm just wrong, and changed my opinion. I'm one of those rare people that actually like changed their opinion.
As a bit of an outsider, like, I mean, I had a gun lesson from Michael Badnarik years ago. Harry Brown was really my inspiration early on. So like some old school libertarian heads there. And Badnarik, I haven't seen him in years, but every time I would run into him for like 3, 4, 5 years after this, when he was teaching me how to shoot a firearm for one of the first times in my life as an adult. I'm mentioning this because you said you were shooting as a kid. I never, ever did. And he would just laugh at me. He's like, oh, your girlfriend, her grouping is, he would always pick on me that my girlfriend's grouping. She was a natural and I'm just garbage, but it's true. So as an outsider, though, I really kind of I don't really watch too many soap operas, but I do on Twitter with libertarians. And I run an organization called the 10th Amendment Center. I do educational stuff. But when I do activism on a state or a local level, I am working almost entirely with Republicans and Democrats who I think are almost entirely disgusting on most of the issues that are incredibly important to me in my life. But on something they're good on. So a Democrat in Berkeley that's really good on wanting to ban facial recognition surveillance. Government can't use this? Hell yeah. Let's do it. A Republican that wants to stop a vaccine mandate in New Hampshire. Hell yeah, let's do that. Like, let's not participate in the enforcement of Biden's new vax mandate. There's legislation that's going to be filed, or it's already been filed. They just don't have a bill number in New Hampshire for this coming session. Yeah, I'll work with them on that as well. But they're probably garbage on a lot of other stuff. So when I watch libertarian infighting, in a weird way, I enjoy the drama, like the sick enjoyment of the drama. Oh, yeah. But I got to tell you, just if you step out of the Libertarian Party world, there's so much more in common than there isn't. Like if you had to work with if you had to have debates with Republicans, at least libertarian right, libertarian left, whatever that may be, I think everyone agrees that wars and empire is horrible. That warrantless surveillance is horrible. That gun control, that prohibition, all this stuff is horrible. There are some issues where there's very contentious, different views on social things. But you know what? That's going to happen. And on these big ones, oh my goodness, everyone, even the most bitter enemies in the LP, are miles ahead of all the Republicans and Democrats out there. And it's a breath of fresh air in some ways.
Yeah. I've stepped out of the party a couple of times for various campaigns or petitions or whatnot. And I'm have the same kind of reaction. I worked on Tulsi Gabbard's campaign and almost ignored the Libertarian primary. Because I was like, the party's going to choose whatever. I wasn't going to be a delegate because I knew that I hadn't paid my dues in time. So I knew that it wasn't an option. I'm like, all right, whatever. Y'all can do whatever you're going to do. I'm going to work with Tulsi. And, I was making people understand like key issues of libertarianism on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Because Tulsi's pretty fucking close. There's you're talking about like one issue. She's got like 7 that she's like almost perfectly libertarian on. And like especially the war on drugs. Like she's a legalize all drugs kind of person, not just
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she's straight up. She's the only other presidential candidate I've seen other than Ron Paul talk about legalizing heroin from a stage.
You didn't know that. That's wild.
She had some really like key points about healthcare that were, she is a single payer healthcare, so like obviously not like super libertarian in her plans, but what she saw as the problems in healthcare were a lot more accurate than your typical Democrat. She was attacking like the like drug patent laws and certificate of need laws, like actually like attacking some of these problems and why it's partially government's fault that healthcare is so expensive. And so I got to like talk about that stuff every day and flip Democrats and Republicans on these issues. And then I'll go back on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, check out the Libertarian Party primary, and Hornberger's attacking Amash because he once was a Republican. And I'm like, guys, what the fuck?
Right.
Are we serious? Don't we want more libertarians?
So what I think is actually what I've experienced, and I've been doing activism like this, like 15 plus years. I found that when I work with people who I disagree with on 90% of things, But I'm actually, when I'm coming from it from a libertarian approach or from a constitutionalist approach, I'm generally better on their core issues than they are.
Mm-hmm.
So a constitutional conservative is big on constitutional carry, for example, or something like that. Or, make sure everyone can get their permits or reduce fees or something. I'm like, well, all gun laws should just not exist. And they're like, wait a second, this dude's pretty hardcore, right? The only thing the ATF is authorized to do is disband, I tell people all the time. That's really the only constitutional thing that they're authorized for. And so then right-wingers will be like, whoa, these guys are pretty hardcore. And then over time, when you're consistent on an issue that's important to somebody, they're more likely that it's not necessarily going to happen, but they're more likely to be willing to listen to you on another issue. And I think you're basically what you were describing there is what I've had happen many, many times. Now I'm just one person, but the more one persons that do this kind of stuff, I think the better off we'll be. It's just my plea to do less libertarian fighting with libertarians, because we live under the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the planet. I think more outreach towards others is probably better.
Amen. So I was listening to your Lions of Liberty episode with Jason Stapleton.
Was this the drunk one?
Yes.
Oh, man. I don't drink.
The one from this past summer.
Oh, yeah. That was here in my apartment. That was fun, I think.
Mm-hmm. Big fan of Jason, too.
He's a really fun guy, too.
I went to a taping of Larry Sharp's show. Just like went and hung out in the studio and watched it happen, and Stapleton was the guest, and I got to meet him and love what he's been doing. Gotta get him on the show. And he's another person like yourself who's kind of given up on the LP and is out here.
I've actually never been in. I'll throw it out there.
Ah, fair enough.
I've never voted. I'm not a member of any party, nor have I ever been. Voters have been screwing it up for all of the rest of us for a long time, but that's
true. That this year I literally didn't vote for anyone that was on the ballot. I did exclusively write-ins. I wrote in Dave Chappelle, Joe Rogan, Bill Burr, Russell Brand, Spike Cohen, Larry Sharp, and my youth pastor, my oldest when I was a kid.
I'm not saying that it's bad to vote. I just haven't found choosing candidate A or candidate B in California isn't going to do anything. I'm not one of those people who's an anti-voter. I just haven't found anything that motivates me to do it. Like, I had thought about voting for the legalization measure last time around, but it was going to pass anyway. So I didn't want to break my streak. I've also never been to a Walmart, so maybe that's the same type of thing.
Nice. I respect that. My one of my claims to fame, not actually, but is I've never given Amazon a dime of my money ever.
I give them way too much, and I actually started peeling off because of the facial recognition stuff that they do, and I do a lot of work on surveillance issues and police state stuff, qualified immunity, drug war, all this stuff, and so I keep seeing Amazon, their Ring product is just a nasty spy device, and they connect to law enforcement agencies all over the place. Fight for the Future does really good work on that if you're looking for an organization who's kind of opposing Amazon surveillance. And I literally tried, but I've become such a subservient fool or something to my Amazon overlords. And then especially, I think really where I dropped it was at the beginning of the lockdowns. And also I'm like, well, all right. For a while, I was tweeting about how, okay, I stopped getting my Mega Food vitamins from Amazon. Now I'm getting them directly from the brand. And I probably should start doing that again. I'm glad you actually said that you've never given them a dime.
Never once. I got a gift card once. And so I used that. But other than that, I've never, and I use that for 2 libertarian books. So that's awesome. I'm considering giving them a dime though, because I don't know where else to buy Michael Malice's Anarchist Handbook.
Oh, it's not available at Barnes and Noble?
Mm-mm.
Only at Amazon.
That's last time I checked. Maybe it's because last time I checked was only like a week after it released. So I could be wrong about that now. But But yeah, I was very sad about that. I've actually tweeted at him a couple times, just like, hey, can I just somehow give you this money so that I don't have to give it to Amazon, please?
Want to read? Where I'm looking on Goodreads. I've heard really good things about it too, and Michael's such a nice guy too. Want to read? Where is it available? Kindle, Amazon. Oh, there it is. Abe Books, Barnes and Noble.
Okay. All right. I'll have to go get it from Barnes and Noble now.
No, they link to a Gary Chartier from literally from Malice's page for the Anarchist Handbook on Goodreads, which is an Amazon product. So you have these options of where to buy it, and they link all these other stores, and the Barnes and Noble one lists to a different one. But yeah, you could probably find it. I don't know, maybe not.
So you were talking a little bit on that Lions of Liberty episode about, different like divisions of labor and how to find your niche within the movement. I'm curious how you found where you wanted to be throughout all the different things that you can do in the movement, and how you might encourage someone else to find what they might be good at.
Well, I think you just take an issue that's important to you and do something. Like, we all are short on time. So if the drug war is important to you, if the police state is important to you, if whatever it is, for me, my approach was, it started with war. And then I made the connection, probably through reading James Madison, that war it's not just the health of the state, but it leads to the germ and danger of every other attack on liberty that's out there. Again, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. Those are Madison's words. And so then I'm like, well, how can I fight against the empire? Well, I can at least point out that the government is the seat of power of the empire. Everything that they do is bad. And maybe that I can chip away. I can do one thing in my life. I can maybe chip away. I can open one person's eyes to this. And I did that through blogging. And then once I opened one person's eyes, I was hungry for another, and another, and another, and another. I was also willing to work a pretty shitty part-time job at $11 an hour for like 2-3 days a week for many years, so I could barely eat. I didn't have a cell phone or a car, or I didn't have any paid TV options. I worked 80 to 100 hours a week building things up. Now I work 40 to 60. I mean, I'm not living large, but it took a long time. Like, basically, I would recommend do something you believe in because you believe in it and you love it and you care about it, whether it's blogging, making videos, doing outreach, working on legislative efforts, staying the fuck away from Washington, D.C. on all of it, because you'll never change anything in Washington, D.C. It's impossible. It is not possible. And even if you get a short-term win, generally, they're still just expanding power anyways. It doesn't matter who wins the elections in Washington. Power is always larger than it was 4 years ago. So work on things locally, community, build communities around that, and do it because you love it. And if you happen to be able to make a living out of it, that's awesome. I do. It's not an amazing living, but I do make a living out of it. But if I didn't make a living out of it, I was happy to find other ways to fund ways to buy food and pay for rent so I could continue spending so much time doing something that I love. For me, it was war, but war leads to everything else. So it became very all-encompassing. For someone who thinks maybe psilocybin or decriminalizing psilocybin mushrooms and things like that, you can do what they did in Denver. Start a campaign, start writing letters to the editor, blogging, doing YouTube videos, teaching people, doing outreach to other organizations, building a website based off of the one issue, build a single issue campaign and do it. There's an old Rothbard quote, and I'll probably butcher the paraphrase, but it's basically the main task for the libertarian in the present epoch. The number one task to libertarian was to shed his needless and debilitating pessimism. That's very easy to do when you believe in liberty, because you see the barrel of the gun behind every program, right?
Right.
So when you love liberty, when you're a libertarian, you recognize that everything is enforced through the barrel of a gun at some point down the line. So it's very easy to be like, man, we are screwed. There's no way to change this around. But he said, shed that. Get rid of this needless and debilitating pessimism. Set your sights on long-run victory and set about the road to its attainment. It's basically, what is it? Lao Tzu? I forget the Chinese philosopher. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. We need lots of single steps. Thomas Jefferson, after those Kentucky resolutions of 1798, calling for nullification of the Alien and Sedition Acts, passed November 10th, 1798 in the House, November 16th or November 13th in the Senate, signed by the governor on November 16th. The day after, he sends his buddy James Madison in Virginia, he sends him a letter with a draft of the resolves. I'm sure I've got, so I don't totally ruin this paraphrase. Let me see if I can quick pull this puppy up because it's so good. Here's how he put it. He says, I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky resolves. We should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain so as to hold to that ground in the future and leave the matter in such a train so that we are not committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. Short version, Jefferson is basically saying, we got to have our ultimate principles. We make it clear, we make it public what our ultimate goal is, but we have to take small steps to achieve it. In fact, he had the same type of approach to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay, in another letter in 1790. He said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We have to be contented for what we can get and always eternally push forward for what we haven't gotten, because it takes time to convince people that freedom is for, even if it's for their own good, it takes a long time to convince people. And the best way to convince people is to show people that liberty is actually better. Yeah. So I actually did a keynote speech at PorkFest 10. This is like maybe a decade ago. And my message there was like, look, how do you get from zero to Rothbard? I think that was the title of the speech, going from zero to Rothbard. Zero meaning you live under the largest government in the history of the world. Well, how do you get from point A to point B or point Z? Well, it's a bunch of small steps. And it's not just telling everyone, oh, you're a stupid statist pig. Everything you believe is wrong. Oh, yeah, you love that doesn't do it. It isn't by handing people Man, Economy, and State. It isn't handing people a great Harry Brown book or any of that stuff. It's literally showing them how it works in practice. One of the examples I gave, I probably did it maybe at that speech, but I used to do a lot. I had met these kids, these entrepreneurs who lived in San Bernardino here in Southern California, pretty poor, high crime, gangland kind of town, I guess, at least at the time. And he was working for the government. And at some point, and I don't know if this was around shutdown times or maybe before that, I don't know, but there was a lot of problems. Maybe this was around the bailout times, 2008, 2009, the economic crisis. And the government wasn't able to provide some of the normal services. And I think they were cutting like a holiday Thanksgiving dinner for the poor. And he had on the side had started a cannabis dispensary. And so he's like, well, what's the best thing that we can do is we can take part of the proceeds and kind of fill in where the government is kind of not doing its job anymore. We'll do the annual Thanksgiving dinner from selling cannabis. I don't know if that was kind of just like one of these stories that got passed around, and did they really do it? I don't know. But I think that's the type of thing that we really need, which is show people that things can happen without government. It's amazing how many people that have been telling me, as I literally just report on, just in the last few days, report on this bill that's going to be considered in New Hampshire to ban the state from helping the federal government enforce the new OSHA mandates on businesses. Literally, this is a piece of legislation. It's a page and a half long. It says no state or local employee will use any personnel, resources, whatever, in any way to help implement or effectuate this executive order or any other similar federal act. And people will say, oh, yeah, what, you don't want workplace safety? Because the mentality is, if the centralized power doesn't do it, you can't have it. And that, I think that's something that we all need to focus on more, is to show that outside of the government control system, things can actually be far better. In fact, there probably could be much better workplace safety if it was a market response rather than government dictates that are one size fits all for an entire country. So,
amen. Well, so apparently we're doing a good job. One of my favorite volunteers and activists saying got a great show.
cool.
So tell me, how did you build your team? How did you find other people that were passionate about these kinds of things and get them to help out?
There's no getting around here. I don't actually have an answer to that. I don't know. I mean, people just reach out. Way more people reach out to say, how can I help, than I've ever been able to actually do anything with. In fact, I used to run kind of a state chapter program, and I had someone that worked for me that managed it. I decided to scrap it because it's kind of unreliable. And maybe you've had some experience with this in kind of a similar type of organization where you have somewhat independent state or local chapters to get a
that always ends well.
Yeah, well, so that's kind of been a struggle. So I basically I had a much larger team, much more heavily reliant on volunteers than paying people years ago. And that became much more work than actually doing the work that's most important. So I kind of narrowed it down, and I'm actually in the process of expanding, adding a couple of team members in the very near future, a couple of part-time people that I'm hiring. But yeah, that's a struggle. I'm lucky to have a few people who have been with me for 7, 8, 10 years, and they do things for very low pay, because I think in this type of thing, it's almost like you're volunteering, but I don't want to rely solely on volunteers, because you can't say, well, you got to finish your work to get paid. So I think the market response is actually an important part of it, being able to actually afford it, to afford to hire people. And I need actually to do much more of that.
Wait, so let me get this straight.
Answer to that.
So let me get this straight. You're saying that a national organization based off of independent state and local organizations, solely reliant on volunteer effort, can't get a consistent messaging together?
No, it was terrible. Is there an inside joke I'm missing?
Well, I mean, it sounds like we're describing the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, I guess so, right?
Yeah, and
I have my inner Trotsky, I have my inner Mao, so it's very important to have messaging right at the 10th Amendment Center. We may believe in decentralization, but we operate like communists. But it is actually really important when you're talking about messaging for a specific organization or activism approaches. So to have people kind of off the reservation becomes problematic.
Yep.
Yeah,
and it's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier with businesses, like the centralized power model is more efficient and it works better. And it's really difficult to kind of balance those two things out of wanting decentralization and freedom and self-sufficiency with your volunteers or your activists, and then also needing that totalitarian streak from the organization. Otherwise, shit doesn't work.
So what we've kind of shifted to is when people want to set up like a local chapter, we actually try to provide them tools on how to accomplish things that they want to accomplish and encourage them to work. It's actually even more decent. In a weird way, there's more centralization in the organization as far as messaging and approach, but there's more decentralization with kind of not officially affiliated people, because we just encourage them to do their own thing, and then we try to provide them support. So, for example, the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act, which we worked on for 8 years in a row before it got signed into law this year.
Wow.
It literally bans the state from helping enforce most federal gun control in the books. We're talking about National Firearms Act of 1934, Gun Control Act of 1968, basically most of it. And the big complaint now that it's not even fully in effect now, it might actually be now, but the big complaint coming from law enforcement lobby groups, which were the most aggressive opposition to this. And in fact, anywhere where we try to ban enforcement of federal gun control, the number one opponents are not the Mike Bloombergs or the Everytown, the gun control activists. It's always cops. The cop lobbies hate it. The reason is because gun control is a drug war tool. They use gun control to prosecute the drug war. So the number one problem that they're complaining about in Missouri right now, and they're actually trying to push to have this kind of watered down, is that it's already causing a lot of law enforcement agencies to stop working with federal joint task forces all around the state. So that to me is a green light. Holy shit, let's push this forward. But really, even though we provided a lot of the intellectual firepower, pun intended, on that in Missouri for a number of years, we provided a lot of the talking points, the legal basis. We helped a little bit with the legislation, but we basically kind of just, it's all kinds of other independent groups that made it happen. So the more decentralized you're going to do on the activism level, a lot of times the more successful you'll be if the people are really passionate about getting this shit done. So luckily there's a guy named Ron Calzone who runs an organization called Missouri First, who they're not necessarily affiliated, but we coordinate with them on a lot of stuff. On how to get bills out of committee, how to change things with this. Okay, well, now these sheriffs are lobbying against it. Well, what kind of messaging can we put out there? What can we do with the sponsor, et cetera, et cetera? So I like that approach better because it's been far more, we've got a lot more stuff actually accomplished going that approach rather than having like an official Missouri 10th Amendment Center chapter and wonder where's that chapter leader now? Oh, they were around for a couple of months. They hit it really hard. And then, well, someone had a baby and now they're gone. Not that people shouldn't have babies, but life happens.
Yep.
And when you're relying on volunteers, that doesn't really prove to be really effective a lot of times.
Yeah. I love that strategy because I think one of the avenues to, doing a thing for liberty that people don't often look at or consider heavily is like starting something yourself. Start a PAC. Like start a lobbyist thing for your state. Like those kinds of things are incredibly useful, and the structure is a lot of times really necessary to be able to do what you want to do. And a lot of times it's going to be easier actually to kind of start a state something and push something through than try to they probably also are having significantly more success with Missouri First than they would with the Missouri branch of the 10th Amendment Center, because they would have to
why do they want some Californian organization coming into Missouri? We would hear that a lot when we try to do that. What the hell, these liberal commies coming into our state? What the hell do they know? So
it would be funny though, considering it's an anti-gun control thing. It's like, what are these commies coming in here and being based on gun control?
Fine. I know. Well, and that's the kind of messaging we would put out there. Well, I mean, you shouldn't even have a permit, because getting a permission slip from government, it's not liberty at that point. And they like that kind of message, but it is much better when people are local, they know the territory, they're known in the area. So if it's, I keep going to facial recognition, but let's say asset forfeiture. Why couldn't someone start a website that said stopforfeiture.newyork.com? Not even a PAC, nothing. Just literally blog about it. Blog explaining what is asset forfeiture, how is it used around the state. Report from Institute for Justice, IJ.org. Look at their report. Like literally blog about it, do podcasts about it, do videos about it over and over and over and over. The minimum you have to put the exact same message out to people and reach them with it is about 20 to 25 times. Back in the club promoting days, we used to use 7 as our number, but I think it's much higher now because people are kind of inundated with a lot more stuff. So my mentality is hit people. If you hit someone with the same message and they read it 20 to 25 times, they're going to be willing to remember what you're talking about. So do that over and over. StopForfeitureNewYork.com. And then as you build that up and you build a social following and things just on that one issue, you can start reaching out to other organizations. Hey, ACLU NY or nyclu.org. I know you guys are on board with stopping forfeiture. Are you guys doing anything legislatively? What can we do? What can I do to support that? There's a lot of organizations that you can do outreach to, but that's basically our approach. We pick an issue, then we find other organizations that also are on board on that one issue. We set aside all the other things that we know they don't agree with us on. I mean, not always. Like I went for a meeting at ACLU headquarters in New York for a lot of the surveillance stuff that we do. And we're sitting there and, we're talking about stuff on a state level, ballot measures and things like that we're working on. And at one point, someone cracked a joke. Well, you guys are kind of into that that gun stuff too, aren't you? Right? And I'm like, well, yeah, but maybe we should get into that because we need to stay friends and stop the spying. So, but they acknowledge that as well. We don't have to agree on everything, but if we can find these connections, we can actually move things forward. But that's to me, that's the best way. If you actually want to do activism, find one issue that you're really passionate about and build your own website for it. They're really easy to make these days. Write about it. Do it daily. Doesn't matter if it's long or short. And then once you start find other people who blog about that issue and ask them if you can cross post and then start sharing it. And then eventually you're going to have other people working with you. That's basically the approach I did with 10th Amendment Center. And we're getting there.
That's awesome. That's, I'm, like I said at the beginning, the fact that what you've been doing for the last decade is actually, changing people's lives like in a tangible way. That going into what we've been talking about for the majority of the show is like, we have to show people that it works. And so, we can talk all we want. We can run candidates. We can, message on a podcast or like our own social media or the party's social media. We can do a lot as the Libertarian Party and as the movement in general, but until people are seeing that freedom and liberty is better than tyranny and oppression, nothing's going to change. And so, I think you're doing the Lord's work on that.
Thank you. There's no better way to describe how this plays out in practice. Again, I'm going to go back to weed, or let's go to cannabis again. In 2006.
Yeah, let's go back to cannabis again.
2010. I'm out doing speeches at what was Tea Party around 2010 or was that 2012? I did a lot of Tea Party speeches.
I think it started up in 2010. I think.
Okay, so
it was between the two Obama campaigns.
I'm doing a lot of speeches to Tea Party groups all around the country. Everywhere I go, I'm talking to them about weed. They don't necessarily like it at first, but if you think about it, by the time 2018 came around, the reddest of the red states, Oklahoma, passed the broadest, at least on a medical end, the broadest medical marijuana ballot measure that has been passed in any state ever, broader than anything ever passed in California on the medical end. The reason is most states, when they passed medical marijuana, the government would restrict the number of issues or medical conditions that doctors could recommend, not prescribe, recommend cannabis to their patients for. In Oklahoma, the red state, the Republicans there approved it where it's up to the doctor. The government would have no say, but that wouldn't have happened in 2010. The reason this happened is all the predictions that the world would end because people were able to buy, sell, consume a plant in various forms were all bullshit. And then people started learning it's bullshit. And on top of it, there's a hell of a lot of people getting rich out of this too. So over time, I think leading by example, there's still a lot of, we were talking about Kristi Noem in South Dakota, right?
Yeah.
But trying to stop a full legalization versus medical is now the worst scenario. in most situations versus let's lock everybody up all the time, everywhere, which was what it was always in the red states back then. So the red states, the worst of the red states, have shifted to the point where they're actually in a place in many situations probably better than it was in California in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
So Oklahoma is better on weed today than LA was in 97. So that's a huge shift. And it's because people led by just did it. And sooner or later, you learn the world doesn't end. I think, although and I've said this a few times in interviews with people, it probably is absurd, but I think the same thing is possible with the left on guns.
I was just about to say that.
Were you? I think it's
Yeah.
possible. I don't know if it could happen in our lifetime, but I think it's possible. To me, it's a very similar type of a scenario. We hear the world's going to end if people have the freedom to be able to own something, buy or sell something. They're going to go get in cars and kill people because they're wasted. And, you know, you have all that reefer madness garbage still left over. But the same type of messaging we hear about the right to keep and bear arms. There's a natural right by the nature of being a human. You have to be able to, this is many of the founders, Mercy Otis Warren, for example, she was called the muse of the revolution. She referred to the right to keep and bear arms as primary law of nature. You can't exist without being able to defend yourself or your home, things like that. You can't live. So you can't have a right to life without an ability to defend it. Yeah. But at some point, it's possible that if people lead by example, the left could learn as well. I think it's probably much harder, but I can tend to be very cynical in the short term, but very positive about humanity in the long, long term, way after. I really, really believe that markets are stronger than government, that liberty will convince people. People will learn that liberty is better all the time. But I just don't think we're anywhere close to that.
Yeah. Well, I think the rise of constitutional carry is a good kind of determination of that. You know, you're talking about the states that legalized cannabis and then, you know, it didn't go to shit. You know, we didn't see some drastic rise in car accidents or anything, right? All of it turned out to be bullshit. I think when the 25 plus states that we have now with constitutional carry, when gun violence doesn't go up in the next 3 to 5 years,
I'd say 20.
Well, I'd say if it doesn't start to go up in the next 3 to 5 years, it would then trigger the process of some of the other states starting to realize that maybe it's not as bad. And then, yeah, I'd probably agree with a 20-year mark for like New York considering constitutional carry.
Right. And I just want to throw out there that I like the term constitutional conservative. My website, we use the term constitutional carry. For example, we just reported this morning on the first time ever chamber, the state Senate in Pennsylvania actually passed the proper term really, I think, is permitless carry. I don't like the term constitutional carry because it implies that the Second Amendment is your gun permit. And so then that also leaves the scenario that, well, if the Second Amendment's your gun permit, then the people who are empowered, that is the courts, to determine the extent of the Second Amendment, that means the right is determined by government. And I really more of in favor of a natural right to keep and bear arms. I'm sure you are as well. This is such a nitpicky thing, but it's one of these things that I get into a lot. I get distracted by that conversation.
I'm very much in agreement with you on the like natural right versus constitutional right, but I do love the kind of attitude that goes with the Second Amendment is my gun permit.
Yes,
like
I do too.
It's badass and I enjoy it, but I also cringe a little bit for the reasons that you're expressing, for sure.
Yeah, I shouldn't make such a big deal. I do on my own podcast. I do a 3 times a week podcast, and anytime that comes up, I'm like, okay, I got to do a side note here, and I'll talk about it for 5 minutes. I'm sure people who listen are just sick of hearing the same shit over and over and over. Yes, we know, Boldin, you have a right to keep and bear arms because you exist, and it has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. You would have that. The case that I make is no one who was drafting or debating whether or not the Second Amendment was going to be ratified ever thought that the right to keep and bear arms wasn't going to exist if they didn't pass it. Like it existed before that, right? So anyways, where were we?
Oh, wow. I don't honestly even remember how we got off onto the
We were
Second
talking
Amendment, right?
about lead
Oh,
by
the
example.
left coming around if we lead by example. Yeah.
And maybe they won't, but I think it's possible. If the reddest of the red states, the Utahs, Oklahoma, and elsewhere, can legalize cannabis, even for somewhat limited medical purposes, then I think California could be in support of the right to keep and bear arms sometime.
Mhm.
Well, we'll say it for posterity, and maybe someone will watch this YouTube in 500 years and be like, whoa, those dudes called it.
That would be, yeah. And so I'm also a huge fan of the phrase, if you go far enough left, you get your guns back. Because I've seen that that's super
I've never
true.
actually heard that, but I get the concept. A really old school friend of mine, his name's Anthony Gregory, who used to do a lot of writing. He worked at a place called the Independent Institute for a long time. He wrote a huge tome on habeas corpus. He's probably, he definitely would be in the left libertarian end, Gary Chartier, that kind of realm. But
Mhm.
Anthony lived in Berkeley, and I remember him once telling me, he's like, yeah, man, sometimes the commies here, they're so far left that they come all the way around. They'll be like, yeah, man, of course I support the Second Amendment. And you'd pause. He says, yeah, the workers, they got to be armed. So they're thinking of a different reason for it. Pete
Mhm.
Seeger, who's one of my favorite musicians of all times, he had this great song talking about like, oh, you want to draft me into your wars, but he says, you know, you want me to carry a gun, sure, but I'm not going to promise which direction I'm going to be pointing it. The old school lefties had that mentality.
Yeah.
Of course, the people needed to be armed because government was oppressive. Somehow that's
Even
been
Marx
turned-
wrote about it.
Of course,
Marx has
was way
under
better on
no
the right to keep and bear
pretext
arms.
should the right to self-defense be. I'm gonna butcher that quote.
There's a great Marx quote that I've always thought of, like putting on some Republican politician or something like that on a meme and just lying about it and then saying, whoop, that was Karl Marx. Not that I'm a Marx fan at all, but this is definitely a mentality that's been lost on the left. So I think it can be regained. I think the goal of the workers got to be armed to overthrow and slaughter millions of people is obviously bad. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't give them any hints.
Well, I've had plenty of people even on the show that are, they consider themselves leftists, and a lot of them will call themselves like true leftists, and kind of that originality, the kind of the way that a lot of libertarians talk about like liberalism or conservatism. They'll talk about their leftism, and I haven't had anyone that's on the left and still believes in gun control on the show that I'm aware of.
Old school, hardcore leftists, not I just vote for whatever Democratic Party candidate kind of leftist.
Right.
I mean, Republicans call everybody that don't agree with them a lot of times, rank and file, just be like, they're all commies, but they're not. They're not. But a lot of those old school kind of Marxist, Trotskyites, Maoists, they're big into the right to keep and bear arms. How else are you going to have a workers' revolution without it?
And that's why, so a lot of those people I met through connections I made, or just directly through the Tulsi campaign. And that's one of my biggest complaints about libertarians in Tulsi is they're always mad about her gun control stuff. And yes, I disagree with her on gun control. Obviously, she's more pro gun control than I am, but she literally moved the needle on, like, in her own beliefs on gun control during her campaign because of how many libertarians she had on her staff and at her events, that she finally was like, we convinced her. Actually, I don't even take any of this credit. Reed Coverdale kind of bullied her into changing her opinion on gun control, because he was just like, listen,
Amazing.
you could get so much more support. You already have so much libertarian support. If you drop the gun control bullshit, which I know you don't believe, like she was the last person to vote on the assault weapons ban. And that was only because her constituency roasted her for being the last person to support it. And so at the end of the day, I can't even really hate her for doing her job and representing her constituency. Like, I know there's a gray area there, but like, if that's the reason that you did something that I disagree with is because your constituency loudly, like very loudly told you to vote in a specific way and you did what they told you to do, like, I can't hate you for that, first of all. And also she not only dropped her like platform planks, but she actually changed her opinion. Like, there were conversations that I had with her that were very much different towards the end. And
so we all come from someplace, right?
Right. And even at the beginning, like, she's the kind of person, at every event, we were handing out pocket constitutions.
That's
like
pretty amazing.
Her views on the Second Amendment were very constitutionally rooted, and like we've kind of been discussing, you know, there's a little too much gray area there for the courts to kind of decide what is and isn't okay. So, you know, she was pro background checks because, but like,
So
very anti like any sort of buyback program.
The NRA is the NICS system. The background check system isn't a tool of the NRA. So was the National Firearms Act of 1934. So is the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988. So, like, I mean, I don't like
honestly them. Was I would say that Tulsi Gabbard is better on guns than the NRA.
I think a lot of people are, but that's cool. That's cool. Yeah. I mean, but I think the point is that you were neocon-ish. I was Trotsky-ish. We all come from somewhere. We're all victims of government-run schooling. And so, and generation upon generation upon generation of this. This is not something, this is no silver bullet if we're going to keep the gun puns going. You said triggered before, though. I thought that was pretty good, too. But this stuff isn't going to turn around. I mean, it really is brick by brick, person by person, literally doing that kind of on the ground outreach and changing minds. And that's why, like, when I started my organization, and like 10th Amendment Center is not huge by any stretch of the imagination, but we do have some impact. We actually have been making things happen. But my goal literally was just to reach a person. And I think if you believe in something and you love something and you do it because you love it and you reach that one person, you just keep going. Maybe you reach two. And if you don't, you just do it because you love it, because it's so important to you. So whether it's asset forfeiture or war or whatever it may be, the drug war, gun control, you take a stand for that because there's kind of a moral thing that's going on. We're like, some people will tell you, oh, well, you guys could still spout your mouth off in the land of the free. But literally, it's more, we still live under the largest government in the history of the planet by far. You know, people will say, you know, we got to stop the Chinese communists. I mean, the U.S. federal government, supposedly federal government, spends somewhere between 8.5 times the amount that the Chinese communists do, with 1/3 the population. So we don't live in the land of the free. That's just nonsense.
And so much less stuff too. Like, at least they get the food and the like the shit. Like, the how do we spend more on nothing?
It's insane. It's literally just the biggest grift in history. And yeah, we're all getting ripped off, and they claim the power to do so much more than what they do. They will continue doing more and more and more. It's like the frog in the boiling pot or whatever, but it's the heat is turning up and they keep doing more and more and more. And if we sit blindly, idly by, it's only going to get worse. So pick something that you love, that you believe in, one issue, and just bust your ass on it, whatever, even if it's 2 hours a week, 5 hours a week, 30 minutes a day, whatever it is, but set a time. We can all set a time. Like, I wake up in the morning and I do some yoga and stretches, but I can also set 30 minutes to do something else. I think we can all do that. And the more that people do that, the more
Mm-hmm.
they're going to feel better about themselves because they're going to have a purpose. I mean, a lot of times the jobs that we work for some shitty company that probably sells facial recognition to cops to abuse people. But we got to earn a living still. So I don't fault people for trying to pay the bills and take care of their family and their home and try to at least live somewhat of a normal life. But we can feel a purpose by picking something that means something to us and try to reach other people and teach them the right approach. Some motivational garbage, but that's how I feel.
I love it. And might I add, while you're cutting out time in your schedule, I very much think that yoga should be part of it too. Schedule some time to do something you love, but block out a little bit extra so that yoga is also in your daily schedule.
It is.
Because yeah.
I have some serious anxiety issues. And once I shifted to that in the morning, plus a little extra CBD dosage in the morning, man, that really has done wonders for me. Like just breathing and taking time to stretch, and it's good for my health as well too.
I'm really excited. Next week I'm having Shane Hazel from Georgia on the show.
Cool.
And
I've never met him, but other than on Twitter.
He's really great guy. And I'm gonna kind of break a little bit of the theme of the show and talk a little bit more philosophical than I usually do, but we're basically the whole point of the show is tackling like the spiritual and mental freedom that you need to have to really be able to actively help set other people free, and like how psychedelic drugs and and yoga and other things like that play into it. So I'm really stoked for that conversation.
I didn't know he was that dude. Is Shane that guy?
So it's crazy. One of the things that I really love about him is the fact that he's from Georgia. He's a veteran. He's got
that street cred,
dude.
Right?
Yeah, and so he's normally talking to right-wingers about right-wing issues. He's talking about like war or guns or these kinds of things. And he does talk about obviously like ending the war on drugs, but a lot of times it's from a fairly normal libertarian-ish rhetoric. That's not one of the ones that he like really goes hard on because it's Georgia, right?
Yeah.
But when I had him on the show probably about 6 months ago, and we just touched on psychedelics for a second, and he was about to start a rant, and we kind of agreed that we needed to continue talking about his governor run and at least save that for another episode. So
that probably won't go over too well in Georgia. Side note, for psychedelics, there's a bill that already passed the state Senate. It's a 2-year session here in California, like in New York. Is New York a 2-year legislative session too, I think? Probably. Anyway, so Senate Bill 519 already flew out of the state Senate to legalize psychedelics, not just decrim, but legalize personal possession and consumption, not retail sales. So not a tax and regulate style, but literally make it fully legal. So it'll
all
probably
psychedelics or just psilocybin?
No, all.
Ooh.
I don't know for sure. So they were trying to push it through in the first year of the 2-year session, and something happened on the assembly side, probably some law enforcement lobbying against it, but it passed easily out of the state Senate, and it's possible it'll come back up again in January. But that would be pretty fascinating to see how that plays out if they actually do that here.
Hell yeah. That would be awesome.
How long have you been? I'm sure we got to wrap this up here in a few, but I'm hungry. So just a quick question. How long have you been in Libertarian Party?
I joined probably like September or October of 2016 when I registered to vote. I was 19, and so I registered to vote with the plan of voting for Gary Johnson. In the same day, I filled out and donated the $10 to the LP National to join the party. And and then went to my first meeting January of 2017 after election holidays, then joined the party.
Gary Johnson is the only presidential candidate who ever spoke at a nullification conference. So So
he gets
a
a lot of shit, but he brought
know
so
he does.
fucking many people in, inclling myself.
Gary,
I can never hate him.
Gary, I think on a lot of issues is very milk toast, but I think he's a very
Yeah.
good human being. Every time he's spoken at events for me in the past, and every time I've spent time with him, this is a guy I can hang out with. Like, I like him as a person. That doesn't mean if I had to agree philosophically with someone having to be hardcore, I could never go to a Thanksgiving. I mean, I like Gary. I'd hang out with him again.
Right. I've done extensive activist work with people who believe the entirety of the government narrative on 9/11. like if
You
we
could have
can
just
do
said the
that,
entirety of government narrative on and just left it blank, right? The reason I asked about how long you've been in the LP, I was wondering how familiar you were with Harry Brown from back in the day.
unfortunately, not very well
You know
until
the name, right?
Jorgensen. Well, when Jorgensen came around, it was all like, "Oh, she was his VP candidate the year I was born, in '96." So, I heard that a bunch of times, and everybody was kind of like, "Rah rah, yeah, Harry Brown was the best." And
He was
so
the
I went.
best.
So I went and looked him up, and so now I'm fairly familiar, or not super familiar, but yeah,
He was great on messaging. The mentality, like in 2008, was kind of like if Ron Paul could put the message out there like Harry Brown could, they would have won. That was kind of like that was the fantasy, right?
Mhm.
But Harry wrote this amazing book, and maybe you've heard it. But what you're talking about with next week's show with Shane made me think of it. But he wrote this great book, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World. It's kind of along that line. Like, how can you look at the world around you and still find your own personal freedom? And if we wrap it up with anything, maybe that would be my book recommendation for the week.
All right. I've heard that. I've gotten that recommendation a couple of times. I'm
Cool.
currently reading The Law by Bastiat, which
man.
is super
Awesome. Awesome.
I'm loving it. I gotta shout out Justin O'Donnell for sending me a little stack of books
Cool.
from a giveaway that he did on his podcast that I won.
You get into any Spooner stuff at all?
So he is at the top of my to read list. I haven't gotten my hands on any yet.
Everyone always recommends Constitution of the Authority, especially ANCAPs, because they're like, oh, you can talk shit about the Constitution. But Spooner did so much. I've done a lot of Spooner reading. And actually, we incorporate a lot of Spooner work into our work at 10th Amendment Center. He wrote great stuff on jury nullification. 1852, he wrote this great paper, Trial by Jury. And then also a defense for fugitive slaves in 1850 literally is the strategy on how to defeat federal programs. Like, it's Spooner nullification style. The short version is basically if they pass, it's basically Jefferson, but Spooner style. If they pass a law that they're not authorized to pass, no one's bound to obey it. And everyone has a right to resist it the moment they enact it. Not later after the courts think about it, not after the next election cycle, but the very moment they pass it, because it's unjust and unconstitutional right from the moment that they try to pass it. So Spooner has some really, really awesome stuff too.
I do really like Spooner. I've read a lot of his quotes. I haven't read
a lot of people do this. He's very memeable. He's very memeable.
So I actually did a daily Spooner quote on my Twitter for about a month and a half. I went through and scheduled it all in like two parts. But like just sat down for an hour and a half and scheduled it all out. But I started doing that with I don't even remember who the first one was, but I've done it with a couple of people where I'll just take like a month and just like every day do a daily quote. And yeah, so I did Spooner, and that one's definitely by far my favorite.
Cool.
But yeah, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I do want to wrap up with one more question, and that's just how can people find your podcast, your other stuff? And I'll ask the question that you said you rarely have a good answer for, and that's how can people help and get involved with the 10th Amendment Center?
Okay, so I'll just give one URL for all of it. And it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. There you find our annual State of the Nullification Movement report. And it's a 108-page free download. It's actually up to 2020. We'll be updating that in the next couple of weeks as well with the new version of it. But we do an annual report that explains the first half of that report explains the entire kind of legal history and constitutional basis for all the strategy that we're talking about here. Like not just the fun stuff, but all the nitty gritty details, how this has been used in support of free speech, against slavery, things like that. And then the second half is how it's being implemented today on various issues, from drug war, asset forfeiture, mass surveillance, gun control, and the like. And I think people, if they just literally read that, could get a lot of ideas on how to actually put these concepts into practice. The website has about 15,000 articles on it over the years. So there's a shit ton of content. It's hard to point people the right direction.
I went in there to do a little bit of research, and I was just like, there's a lot. And I watched like probably at least a half a dozen to probably like 10 of your videos. And I was like, oh, this is so great. I'm so excited.
There's a lot of stuff. The podcast is Path to Liberty. It's on all the major platforms, and I live stream on YouTube 3 times a week. YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitch, Odyssey, all that stuff.
Nice.
But really, the place that I want people to go if they want to read and then do stuff is 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. I think that's the best place.
All right. So at the moment, if you're watching live, there's a link in the description that is just 10th Amendment Center. I'm going to change it to have the /report. But
there's a link in the navigation too. I mean, if they go to the website
too. So definitely go check that out. Follow him. I've had both his Twitter and the 10th Amendment Center's scrolling across the bottom. Michael, thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic. Like I said, you're someone that I've looked up to for a while. So this is really great. Also, shout out to Spike Cohen for making this happen.
Oh, Spike. Yeah, he reached out to me. Was that so cool?
I
like him a lot.
He's amazing. I actually was just hanging out with him last night. And we were at a fundraiser. And then there was an after party after the fundraiser. And I would talk to him at the fundraiser. And I was like, so we're doing this. And then we're doing that. And then I have to drive home, which is about a 2-hour drive. And then I get to interview Michael Boldin.
Oh, nice.
So
I only will do an interview if someone drives 2 hours.
All right, guys.
Yes, thank you to Spike. Spike, I wish I was hanging out with Spike. That's pretty cool.
Gotta come around. Well, actually, he hadn't been in New York in a while, so I can't say gotta come around New York because I don't know if he's gonna come back anytime soon.
Right. Well, I really appreciate you having me on the show. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun, and we should do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely, guys. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow night with Killian Hobbs from Being Libertarian. So check it out tomorrow night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, keep up the fight.